Welcome everyone to the talkback or the post-performance discussion of this very new and exciting play, Black Henry, a new play by Luis H. Francia, directed by Claro de los Reyes. Before we begin our post-performance discussion, I'd like to recognize our sponsors for this beautiful and exciting play. We'd like to thank our sponsors, SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU, the King Juan Carlos Center at NYU, and of course, the Atlantic Pacific Theater. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce two important artists who created this beautiful work that we saw today. I'd like to start by introducing the playwright. Luis H. Francia is a poet, a nonfiction writer, and a playwright. In addition to the forthcoming Thorngrass, his poetry books include Tattered Boat, The Beauty of Ghosts, and Museum of Absences. He is a Palanca Prize winner in poetry, Manila's prestigious literary awards body. He is the editor of important anthologies that have shaped Filipino-American studies, or what we now call Filipinx studies. These anthologies are Brown River, White Ocean, a 20th century anthology of Philippine literature in English. He is co-editor with Erica Malinda, the literary anthology entitled Flippin', Filipinos on America, and with artist Angel Velasco Shaw. He is co-editor of the anthology Vestiges of War, the Philippine-American War and the Aftermath of an Imperial Dream, 1899 to 1999. His memoir, Eye of the Fish, A Personal Archipelago, was awarded both New York's 2002 Pen Open Book and the Asian American Writers Literary Awards. So in 2016, his re-reviews, recollections, and reflections was awarded Manila's National Book Award for Best Essays in English. He is included in the Library of America's Becoming Americans, 4 Centuries of Immigrant Writing. His first full-length play on the absurdities of dictatorial rule, entitled The Strange Case of Citizen de la Cruz, was given its world premiere by Bindlestiff Studio in San Francisco in 2012. And what we just witnessed today, Black Henry, is his second full-length play. He is an adjunct professor at New York University's Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. Our second artist, who is the director and one of the actors of Black Henry, is Claro de los Reyes. Claro is a New York City-based playwright, actor, educator, and a social practice theater artist. His theater works aim to raise questions about transnational histories and its intimate influence on the present. As an actor, he has performed with New York theater companies that include NATCO, Pan Asian Rep, Leviathan Lab, and International WOW. As a theater maker, he has had the honor of co-creating theater alongside community members in New York City, Minnesota, the Philippines, and Rwanda. Recent accomplishments of Claro include the Laundromat Project Create Change Artist Commission, National Artist Strategies Creative Community Fellow, Downtown Artist in Residence, Epic Theater Ensembles Spotlight Playwriting Commission. Claro is the founder and director of Atlantic Pacific Theater, or the APT, a theater company committed to exploring cross-cultural exchange and pluralism. He is also directing, and of course, he directed this international cast of actors for Black Henry that we just witnessed. So I'd like us to start off with, saying congratulations to both of you. Thank you for this beautiful play that you have just introduced to the world. So maybe we can start first with Luis. Luis, why Enrique? Why were you drawn to Enrique as a figure, a historical figure?
Well, very many years ago, I had read the story of Magellan and Enrique, and that led me to the journals of Pigafetta. And once I read the journals, and there are three versions. Um, I read the one that was translated from the French, but at any rate, suddenly when they get to Cebu, Enrique comes to the forefront. For most of the voyage, you don't read of him, you don't hear of him. And when they're in Cebu, he becomes essential to Magellan's mission because he can speak the language, he looks like the Cebuanos, and therefore I became interested and I tried to think of what Enrique was like. And so I began to think of writing a story. I hadn't thought then of writing a play, but then, as it turned out, the direction that my interest led me to was to create a play, which is now Black Henry. And for me, Claro was really the not. I mean, Enrique was really the prototype, one could say, of the modern Filipino,
Mm, yeah.
particularly the overseas Filipino worker,
Ah,
and particularly the workers in the merchant marine and in the cruise industry. In both of those areas, Filipinos make up the bulk of workers. And there's also, of course, the Filipino diaspora, which is responsible for sending close to $30 billion a year to the Philippines. So, in the figure of Enrique, um, were all these modern day concerns, and also the fact that he may have been the first person to circumnavigate the globe. Because if we assume that he was from that area, not necessarily from Cebu, but from the Visayas or close by, then even before Sebastian Elcano and the rest of the survivors made it to Sevilla in 1522, Enrique was already in his home turf in 1521. And this is a view shared by a few historians and writers. And so I do think there is some basis to make the argument that Enrique de Malacca was, in fact, the first known person to circumnavigate the world. So all of these elements drew me to him and to create the story and focus on the relationship between him and Magellan because they were together for a decade. And that's how the genesis of the play came about.
great. Thank you, Luis and Claro. There's a question on Facebook. The viewers can send questions as we're having our conversation. The first question that was asked was why the title? So maybe I can hear it from the playwright, but maybe the director also has his own idea of what the play means. So why is it entitled Black Henry?
Well, Henry is the English translation of Enrique. And basically, he was known to his crew mates as Enrique el Negro, Enrique el
Mm.
Indio.
Ah, I see.
So, of course, there's a lot of resonance there given what's been happening the past couple of years,
Yeah,
with Black Lives Matter
absolutely. Yeah,
and the whole issue of the racial hierarchy that colonialism engenders.
right.
And so, while I was casting about for a title, um, I came upon this notion of both race and his name.
Mm,
And so Black Henry seemed a perfect fit,
right.
you know. So yeah, and I hope certainly that that came across
Yeah.
in the language, in the dialogue, particularly where Barbosa tells him, you know, you black, miseducated son of a bitch, blah blah blah.
Right.
So obviously, race is a factor in the play.
How about for you, Clara? Do you have any readings of the title?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, it's quite provocative, especially today in the national and global dialogue around race. I think it's quite provocative, especially because in global terms, you see this idea of color across beyond the United States, in the Philippines, where for folks who create a lot of work around colorism and issues like that. But
Mm,
even this idea that Asia is not a color, even though in the national dialogue a lot of the time Asian is equated to be a color. There's actually multiple colors in the Asian identity, and I love how this play highlights that. Right, Enrique, and there are many groups in Southeast Asia or arguably all over the world that have multiple colors, except the limits of a lot of the conversation equate the term Asian with a specific color, and that's quite inaccurate in my opinion. There's quite many colors, as we can see in this play. Everyone except for the Spaniards were playing Filipino, and I
mm,
think you see this in depictions in media, even in the Philippines, even in Southeast Asia, where they tend to, only promote certain looks
yes.
languages, which is a different conversation, which we don't need to go to, but there is sort of a privileging of dominant culture, dominant skin colors, um, even within a local context. So I thought it was provocative because it brings in the conversation of color and probably perhaps caste systems that are created because of that into the Southeast Asian conversation, and how that it obviously operates in a very different way than it does, because the history is quite different than the United States, but it does operate.
Wonderful.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, sure.
One of the popular terms for Filipinos is they're known as the blacks of Southeast Asia,
Mm, mm,
both as Latinos and as the blacks of Southeast Asia, because
mm,
of our propensity, our talents for singing and entertainment.
mm,
Um, and so we have, of course, all these different bands that travel through Southeast Asia.
yeah.
And so there's this notion that the Philippines may be in Southeast Asia, but it's quite different. And one way to conceptualize the difference in the eyes of many Southeast Asians is that we can be seen as black.
Mm,
You know.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of Asian American study scholars who look at Filipinos in popular Filipino Americans or Filipino immigrants in popular culture, and how we participate and are part of American culture, whether it's jazz. There was just somebody posted an image of Danny Barcelona, who
Mhm.
was the drummer of Louis Armstrong. I had no idea that Louis Armstrong worked with a Filipino for his band. But this is another question for both of you. Um, this is a question about the performance or the production of the play. For Luis and Claro, what did you learn producing the play in this new format, this global theater format? Does it open different ways of understanding the story of Henry, as well as the story of the Battle of Mactan? So anyone can answer the question.
Maybe I'll attempt to do so, and you can add to it, Luis. I think first, during creating work during the pandemic, um, I want when Luis reached out to me, at first we were planning to do a live performance.
Mm,
But I've been a proponent to creating work during this context for various reasons. And I think for this play, the stars kind of aligned because again, it's a transnational play,
Mm,
and we wanted to bring in transnational aesthetics. Essentially, it would have been a lot easier to have a local cast and only negotiate one time zone, um, but because of the conceptually matching the play's theme was something that me and really the vision of Atlantic Pacific Theater is all about, is really looking to deviate from current aesthetics, right? Current non-for-profit structures that limit how you collaborate across time and space. And so, and with the fortune
that's
that
great.
I have I have a community in Manila, and I have a community across the United States of theater makers in the Filipino diaspora. I've always wanted to collaborate with them without needing to be flown there or having raising the funds to fly them here, et cetera, et cetera. And so at first I was, of course, there's a lot of challenges in this new medium, and we can talk about that in a bit, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And because of this opportunity, you can actually double down in circumventing a lot of structures that have perhaps limited who participates and who has access to these experiences, right?
Yeah,
Either it's a ticket price, or you've had to go to a certain school to be able to participate in this. The classic gatekeeping of art culture, Western culture, it's definitely, I think, in every art form, especially it happens in the theater, it happens in visual art. I'm sure it happens in writing, and that's actually, in my opinion, that's a very colonial mindset and things. And if we go down to the root of it, it's like, how do we just give access and collaborate with anyone who's interested, no matter what school, what language, what color they are? And it might be an idealist perspective, but a lot of that comes from being able to green light the aesthetics of producing that doesn't have to follow chase money or chase likes or chase subscribers or big grant funding. Again, could be my idealist side. I identify as an independent producer. I mean, put an asterisk on that because I think producer is still kind of a new thing for me, but I am excited by this idea of deviating from colonial structures. And I think that goes to how, not only how you produce work, but how you treat your coworkers on a
yeah,
day-to-day basis, and how much time do you give them. And yeah, I mean, we can get on and on about that. And I thought, because this is a new medium, because it's online theater,
yeah.
then half the work of selling people on doing something non-traditional is there, right? And so all of a sudden everything's tipped on its head. So how do we go even further with that? How do we use it as an opportunity to really try and decolonize process, right? We have
Oh,
actors from the Philippines. We have actors from the Philippine diaspora. And I think people from at least in the Filipino American diaspora, should be talking to each other instead of, the regionalisms that exist back home, but even here. And
yeah.
so anyway, I have a lot of ideas and theories and conversations with my contemporaries about these things. But if I have an opportunity to apply them into my practice, I will. And this was a perfect opportunity to do so.
You did.
Yeah.
This is exactly what you did. You really created this new aesthetics and new process, Claro. But what about you, Luis?
Well, just to push the ideas that Claro just presented, it's really a democratizing process, the way of presenting theater through Zoom online, because as is evident, you can bring in different people
Yeah,
from different places together, and you don't need to go through the arduous process of raising funds to bring, say, you wanted to have Ibes in a live production in person, we would have had to bring him over, pay for his stay, etc., etc. And so, um, for me, what was really interesting was how difficult it seemed to me to translate what I wrote for the stage on the page, how the challenge in translating that to online theater was formidable. And in many ways, I felt that writing the play was the easy part, because you there's the convention of the theater and there's the wall, but in a way, this where there is a kind of online wall, but we're able to break through as well. So, and of course, the tech person who was helping us all along, Isabelle, who's of course uh, making sure we're all being heard and seen. A large part of the credit goes to her, and I mean the whole team worked together, and that to me was really difficult. It was a circumnavigation of the globe metaphorically. Fortunately, no one died. Nobody had to eat
True.
rats. Nobody had to engage in mortal combat.
Yeah.
It was all a fight together, you know.
And
So, yeah.
just to add to Luis, I think he just triggered something I wanted to say, which was, this pivot, not just the actors, but like who you collaborate with, right? We were intentional. We committed to Zoom, and then I was like, all right, it doesn't seem appropriate to have a live stage designer and a costumes person. And then I reached out to my community of visual artists, and I was like, I really want to work with you all, and this was an opportunity to do so. So I got really excited to work with people who've never done theater before, because I feel like the that lateral thinking when you work with non-traditional collaborations really pushes the medium. So we worked with cinematographer Charles Reynoso and visual artist Francis Estrada and textile artist Cynthia Alberto, all who've never done theater. And the conversations we've had together to translate and really meet in the middle of these mediums, because this is not exactly this is not exactly theater in a traditional sense. It's kind of in between. So I felt like when forming a team, you had to meet in between as well. And so, you know, um, finding out from a filmmaker and a visual artist and a textile designer, what works, what doesn't work, and what doesn't work even in traditional theater sense in Zoom. We were all finding out together, but also learning from this experience. And I honestly think that's what art is all about, is asking questions and venturing into the unknown. That's when you create things. And I think that's what Magallanes was trying to do, and that's what Enrique de Malaca was trying to do. So yeah, there was, obviously thematic and conceptual parallels to what we were doing, and in the play as well.
Okay, so I did want to mention that that question was from Professor Jordana Mendelson. So thank you for that question, Jordana. So our next question is, so from New York, we moved to Manila, and we have a question from theater scholar and actor Sunita Mukhi, and she has a question about language. Now, would it be possible, if we're thinking also about democratizing theater and decolonizing process, what would this play be like if this was translated into Filipino or maybe Spanish? Would it be more powerful, or what would you think,
Well,
Luis and
actually,
Claro?
the play has been translated into Filipino
Yes.
and into Cebuano. Some years ago, the Cebuano translation came first. My friend and playwright Linda Faigao Hall, whom
Ah,
Clara knows as well, um, every year until I guess last year, goes back to Cebu, where she's from. And she has a writer's workshop. And I said, hey, might be great to have a reading of Black Henry in Cebu. And she said, great. And we found a poet, Simeon Dum Dum, to translate the original into Cebuano. And
mm,
so the reading was given in Cebuano in Cebu.
wow.
And then almost 2 years ago, I did send the play to the Cultural Center of the Philippines, Tanghalang
Mm,
Filipino, and they were interested, but they said we need to have it translated into Filipino.
mm,
So I got in touch with a good friend, the poet Pete Lacaba, and I've known Pete since our days at university, and he agreed to do it. And so he came out with a translation into Filipino. But then, just as Tanghalang Filipino, which is the resident theater company at the Cultural Center, just as when we were about to have a contract, the pandemic came, and
Yeah.
so all bets were off, and their whole programming, as the whole program for the world, came to a pause.
Right. Mm.
And so that's been put on the back burner, and maybe some at some point there will be a staging in Manila in Filipino.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I want to just quickly respond to that. I think it's a fascinating question, and it could be a really big question in this idea of translation, especially in the Philippine context, but also in the U.S. context, right? Whereas U.S. Um, obviously, English is the lingua franca, and we're always pushing for more language access for various groups of immigrants in this country, or even indigenous communities who do a lot of language preservation work. Um, in the Philippines, right? It's obviously a different context, but also an important one because that could be we speak about colonization, right? There's this phenomena back home that I know Luis and Nerissa, of this colonial Tagalog phenomena that people love to think critically about, right? About
Mm.
what
Yeah.
defines the Philippines. Is it Tagalog culture? Is it some other culture? Is it English? And I think, I think it's just a fascinating question. I don't have quite the answer, but I think if we're looking at democratizing plays, it's really producing more work in the diversity of the Philippines, and also producing more work with the different colors in the Philippines and the different other cultural things. It's not, I don't know. I mean, again, I can't really speak because I work in a New York, United States context, but I would love to sort of just see that happen. Access is interesting, and producing or making it mandatory that if a X amount or 30%, 25% of the population speaks this language, then maybe that should be produced. 25%
Mm.
art in that country needs to be produced in this language, and 25% of the art needs to be produced in that language. But again, I can only speak from the context here and what I can observe at a distance, even though I spent some time back home. I think that that's a great thing to always keep in mind is, language is not only a way of communicating, there's actually a belief system within it. And so the act of translation is in itself political and can really determine what is accessible, even if it's free, right? What is accessible to a mass and what is able to sort of be received and thus enrich in their understanding of the world. And if that's not broadly accessible, then we're only catering to the privileged class or a dominant class. I mean, that's a pretty broad statement. I just wanted to comment on that.
But
Great. Great.
it's interesting too because Cebuano was the language that's prominent in the journals of Pigafetta
Mm.
when Miguel Legazpi comes in 1565. They go back to Cebu.
Mm.
And for the longest time, the Cebuanos keep saying, hey, why is Tagalog the basis of the national language? Shouldn't it be
Right.
Cebuano? So, yes, what Claro said is absolutely true. There's this whole colonial framework within which we can view Tagalog, because for the Cebuanos, they feel it should have been Cebuano. Of
Right.
course, we have other languages that have as many speakers. I mean, Ilocano,
Yeah. Yeah.
Kapampangan, Bicolano. But the good thing is now well, for many years now, the Cultural Center of the Philippines does acknowledge the different languages and gives awards based on the different languages. So there's
Yeah.
an opening, you
Yeah.
know, and I think that's wonderful because, let a thousand flowers bloom.
Mm.
As many languages as we have, I don't
Yeah,
see that as a weakness. I see that as a strength.
yeah, yeah.
And actually a real move towards not moving the Philippines from being a monolithic identity, which I think sometimes happens within the Filipino identity, and then even broadly speaking in this country, the Asian identity, quote unquote,
Mm,
right? Again, that's going to be opening up a can of worms, but I think really producing diversity will always be the better move, I think.
Mm.
yeah. And of course, we have 150 languages in the Philippines. So, if we really want to honor that, the reality of the archipelago, there should be many works of theater in different languages. But it is happening. Luis is right. The cultural center of the Philippines is doing more of that now. So this is another question from the audience. This is from writer and activist Bina Orden. And Bina Orden asks, in addition to giving voice to Enrique de Malacca, we also hear the voices of the Queen and the Princess, and I loved Princess Ilang. Um, so were these characters largely imagined, Luis, or is there historical documentation of the women? And connected to that is how you portrayed the conversion of the queen. The Rani was a true convert, and I just wanted to hear more your decisions about how you thought about the conversion of Humabon and the queen. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question, but I'd also like to remind people that this is a work of fiction. Not that it's not true, but certainly I did find references to the principal concert of Humabon because he had a number of concerts, but she was the main one. She was his main squeeze, as we put it. And Ilang is a creation of my imagination because the Spanish or the crew of Magellan, they were shocked at how sexually liberated
Yes.
the Cebuanos were, and virginity was not ever an issue with the women. So I wanted to bring in a woman who represented this kind of active role that would have been strange to the Spanish and the Portuguese.
Right.
Okay, so I wanted, and thus came about Ilang,
Mm,
and so she's a foil
mm,
and a companion to Humamay. In terms of the conversion, there is some evidence to show that she really did convert. I mean, you can debate whether she did or not, but for purposes of the story, and because we've been a Christian nation for more centuries than I would care to remember, that the seed was planted and the Santo Nino statue was saved, although there's been some scholarly debate as to the origins of that statue, which I won't get into. So my feeling was Humabon is a practical man. He doesn't care. He's a worldly man.
mm,
His queen was more of the spiritual person. And
mm.
the tradition of Babaylan
Yeah.
were mainly women who
Yeah.
acted as the spiritual guides for the community. So
Right.
that's the
Right.
long and short of it.
Right. Um, okay, so this is a question from Eloisa Cardona. And this is again about the women characters, Luis. I appreciated the portrayal of the women as having more agency before contact with the Spanish. I'm interested in the research process that or maybe just your process of writing, Luis, because of course you mentioned that this is a work of fiction too, but maybe was there also some kind of process in your decisions for the women? Um,
Well, I did some research in 2003 on the basis of getting a grant. I was able to go to Cebu and use the archives of the San Carlos University, which, by the way, is I think even older than Santo Tomas, University. But at any rate, they do have archives there, and I went there and I spent some time. And of course, just from personal experience, you know, um, matriarchy has always been the primary basis, from my point of view, of how even modern Philippine society is arranged.
Mm,
Um, and so it's both historical research and personal.
mm,
My grandmother, on my mother's side, was the first superintendent of education in the Ilocos. She rode a horse to visit these areas. Her mother refused to attend her wedding because my grandmother was marrying an American.
an Americano. Yes.
So my great grandmother dressed in black, basically was saying, how can you marry the enemy? So on my mother's side, there's the strong female figure.
Mm,
And just the fact that we've had two women presidents in the Philippines, whereas in this country it seems to generate agonizing, soul searching debate. Should we have a woman president or not?
yeah,
And in the Philippines, that's a no brainer.
yeah.
We don't particularly care. And that's because we have this matriarchal basis.
Mm,
And so
Yeah,
interesting.
2003, when I was doing research, Cory had just was no longer the president.
Right, right, right,
And I think Gloria Arroyo was coming on the scene.
right.
So that's part of why I arrived at, this women having their own agency.
yeah,
Mhm.
and I always want to add because I think it was a great reminder. I've been tuning in to some of the conferences that are associated to Sulo the past few days, and this idea of a matriarchal Philippines can be extended to our history with different gender identities, right? Luis talked about babaylan, and it goes beyond just male and female, right? There are other
Absolutely.
identities that exist in the Philippines that were seen before the monotheistic religions came. These were seen as has a higher status. So on top of the strong women, there were also strong identities who perhaps didn't identify as male or female, and they were seen
Right.
as
Mm.
leaders in the community. Babaylan being one example, and then I'm sure I'm not an expert in this, but I know enough to know that there were other realities that existed, and of course the history of colonialism perhaps took their status down, perhaps violently, and we can still see that today if you can track the legacy of the gender inequality and that type of stuff in the Philippines and beyond. So I just wanted to put that out because I think it relates to as the women's status went down, so did the other gender identities that exist
Yes,
in the Philippines, and we still see that.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, uh, Luis, there's a question from fiction writer Lara Stapleton. Um, is it, is there any, uh, is there any historical sources or something that tells us about Enrique and how his languages? So I think it's a curiosity of uh, Lara Stapleton about the languages that Enrique spoke. Would you have any information about that?
Well, I'm assuming that since he was Magellan's alipin or slave or body man, he would have learned Spanish
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Portuguese.
yeah.
So he became multilingual. And so, in many ways, again, he's the prototype and is the forerunner of the modern day Filipino, where in order to survive in the diaspora, we have to learn a different language, or even within the Philippines, There's English, of course. There's the Spanish connection. A lot of languages, indigenous languages in the Philippines, have loan words from Spanish. There's the loan words from Chinese. So the very situation that Filipinos find themselves in lend themselves easily to a multilinguality,
Yeah.
you know. And so Enrique, to survive, must have had more than one language to use. So yeah, definitely, um,
Right,
the fact that he survived for 10 years meant that he was able to parlay in
right,
more than one language.
right. But he also spoke possibly Malay and
Yeah,
Cebuano, or
yeah.
Bisaya, right?
Well, there's the argument made that he probably Malay was the common language of Southeast Asia, and some make the argument, well, since he spoke Malay, he couldn't be Cebuano, which I find curious. I speak English in the Philippines, that doesn't necessarily make me less Filipino,
Mm,
Right.
So speaking Malay doesn't is not an argument to say that he was not from Cebu.
right,
And,
absolutely.
and to add to that is the borders; those borders weren't drawn yet, right?
Yes.
Yes,
South, the Philippines and Malaysia borders and Indonesia, they weren't drawn because the
correct.
Spaniards have not come yet. So either way, that he's from Southeast Asia because there is no demarcation between that side or this side because those colonial borders have been drawn yet
Right.
at that point. So in a way, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
All right. So I wanted to uh, ask a question to Claro about the ending that you chose, the image that you chose for the ending of the play, which is the dilapidated Santo Nino. Is there a reason for that image, that choice of the dilapidated Santo Nino? And this is a question from scholar Matthew Nickdell. Go ahead, Claro.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that credit goes to our cinematographer Charles Reynoso, who, along with Francis Estrada, were helping me with the visual language of the play. And I don't want to speak for Charles because again, um, you know, uh, but that was really taking it off the text of what Luis wrote in that last scene, right? And we wanted to sort of put it in this like liminal space of whether having the audience interpret it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that Christianity has come to the islands, right? And I think that duality, or perhaps more than that idea of whether this religion or this belief system was better or not is up for debate, and it will continue to be up for debate for the rest of our time, uh,
Mm,
along with other things. And it's funny that you mentioned it as a dilapidated. That's not quite how I interpreted it, but it's like also fine because that's the beauty of theater and visual arts, right? The audience can interpret the way they want to interpret, and we actually intentionally wanted it to have a little bit of ambiguity in it because as a storyteller, I love ending in a type of a question because
mm,
perhaps the question lingers a little bit deeper for the audience to think about it, think critically about it, and perhaps be in conversation with one another about it.
yeah. Yeah, I saw it also. I mean, Matthew Nickdell saw it as dilapidated, but I also thought that it looked a little worn. I mean, it makes sense. They've been on a boat for how many months? A year
Two
right?
years,
two
almost 2 years.
years, right? So I would imagine that it would be all beaten up. But I was very moved by some of the lines from the play, Luis, when after the death of Magellan, the Filipinos the Cebuanos were talking to each other, saying they will come back with more crosses, more guns, and more deaths. And I was very moved by that. So it was in a way like your gesture to linking to our present. So I think that there are moments your play when it already, you want us to know that this is the beginning. This is the beginning
of the end.
of more deaths. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Could you
definitely.
say more?
Obviously, I'm writing from the perspective of somebody who's raised in post-colonial, not quite post-colonial, I mean, straddling both worlds, but I did want to show the anticipation that
Yeah,
the voyage of Magellan generated, so I put that in that particular scene, you know.
yeah, yeah. And then for Claro, I was telling you how, I mean, I'm a big Aguirre Wrath of God fan. So when I saw the close up of the, I mean, I wanted to ask you that. I mean, you chose to focus on the back of Magellan wearing his costume, and of course not his costume, Magellan wearing his armor. And then when he would be speaking, we don't see Magellan. We hear him, but we see the visual image of the close-up of his costume. Sorry, his armor. Can you tell us what was the choice for that,
Yeah.
image and scene?
So much of the credit again goes to our cinematographer Charles Reynoso, and I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, how the beautiful mix of having different creative thinkers and how you tell stories in this medium, which is quite new. Um, yeah, we sat with in a production meeting with Francis Estrada and Charles Reynoso months ago, and we were like, okay, so this is medium. I've seen more Zoom theater than they have because I'm a theater person, and we were like, all right, let's not, first of all, let's not look at the screen. We wanted to just not do that because that looked too much like what everything else is going on with the Zoom theater. We wanted to really approach it in a different way, and really lean into graphic novels as a way, looking at how
Ah,
you look at graphic novels in certain scenes. Obviously, we could how we can pull it off, and looking at how do they tell stories in graphic novels, and
yeah,
close-ups, how do you obscure certain things, and how does that add tension and expectation. Again, that's quite a different,
right.
interactive in its own way, graphic novels, right? Because the audience still interprets the timeline and fills in gaps between images. And so those cinematic touches, again, much of the credit goes to Charles Reynoso, but we did have conversations on how do we build tension visually, and when we can, sprinkle in those moments without obviously having all actors on stage all at once, and again,
Yeah,
really trying to lean on to experimenting. How do we tell stories in this medium? And it's really a mix between mediums, live theater, because the actors were live, and we were asking them to do all types of um, challenging things, hoping that their
yeah,
dog doesn't bark, or a toilet doesn't flush, or an ambulance
true.
doesn't come in, or a rooster doesn't come in. So all those things, but we embrace that, because I think
Mm,
this medium, in the same way that there are variables in theater, variables in film, variables in all live story or storytelling mediums, whether you meet the deadline, your budget went out, there are variables in every medium. And so we were like, okay, let's identify these these variables and embrace them. And so going back to your question, because I kind of strayed away, um, a lot of those was just really looking at how do graphic novel artists tell stories and progress stories, create tension in that way.
wonderful. Um, so I think that we are almost close to the end of our uh, post-performance, our talk back event. I would like to give the last words to both the playwright and the director. I'd like you to tell us what is the future of this global theater that you have just been, the new creators of this new form. Can you tell us how you feel? What do you think about the future, the possibilities of this new theater form? Anyone?
Well, first, a feeling of relief that we've managed to present the play with very minor glitches,
Mm,
and now that there's that feeling of catharsis, to move on, and hopefully that this will be the beginning of
Yes.
a navigation to better and bigger ports in
Yeah.
terms of producing the play and other plays. But certainly, a lot of credit goes to Claro and the cast and the creative team. I would have no idea because I'm not visual at all.
Mm.
I would have been completely lost at sea, if you don't mind my bringing in other nautical metaphors. I would have drowned. So hopefully from here we will be able to um, build back better.
Okay, so new navigation. And Claro, what would you like to say about this new form?
I mean, my hope is that there's a potential to really make not just an aesthetic, but a social pivot in this type of medium. You mentioned it earlier, Nerissa, about um, democratizing the process of not just being able to experience rich creative experiences, but be able to collaborate with people without the local politics of who's famous and who has the funding and who's boggy and who's whatever. Honestly, I think that is all part of colonial mentality, and
Absolutely,
chasing money, chasing likes, chasing accolades is all colonial, in my opinion. And if we
absolutely.
can remove that as much as possible from creating work and really just share stories that's hopefully free. Again, I can acknowledge that we're in a capitalistic society, and that's true for the Philippines as well. And so there are things to negotiate, but I think there are opportunities in mediums like this where you can green light things with a little creativity, a willingness to do so. And lastly, I chose to have an international cast because I'm a theater person and I know how rich an experience of communing with people who are different from you can be over a long period of time, over a rehearsal process. That shared experience can really transcend and perhaps get us closer to true connection across differences. And if I can share that with friends and family and collaborators in the Philippines, in California, in Washington State, in New York, and New Jersey, and to be honest, anyone who's interested in just having the will and the kindness to experiment and adventure together, I think a medium like this allows for that because what it does is it's free from perhaps the shackles, for a lack of a better word, of aesthetics that have business aesthetics attached to it.
Yeah,
A lot of the time, I relate that to colonial mentality.
yeah,
That's a big conversation, but I'll stop with that. I think there is this pivot that this medium in between this performing in this liminal space can actually allow for other deviations that hopefully you might pair the process and production of it with the theme and content of the play. Because sometimes I honestly don't feel that the aesthetics of production, the capitalistic way of things are produced, actually doesn't match the message of the content.
absolutely. Yeah. And what is beautiful is that this new play and this new form actually matches, but it's odd. This is a play about conquest, the beginning of conquest, and then it's a hopeful play too, because I think that it is a play that speaks to those of us, the descendants, those of us who are uh, the living aftermath of the violence of conquest. And on that note, with the words of will and kindness, if there is the will and kindness to create new forms of theater in these very dark times, then maybe there is hope. And art always gives us hope. So maraming salamat. Thank you for joining us for this event. Thank you very much, Isabelle, who is behind the scenes helping us with this, with the tech. But thank you very much to the playwright, Luis H. Francia, and of course, the actor, director, Claro de los Reyes. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon in a new production. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.